a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Okay, World War II, Depression, but you think FDR had it easier than Barack Obama? Well, Vice President Joe Biden seems to think so, telling a crowd in Milwaukee, and I quote here, "No president, I would argue, in the 20th century, now including the 21st century, has had as many serious problems which are cases of first instance laid on his table. Franklin Roosevelt faced more dire consequences, but in a bizarre way, it was more straightforward." I have no idea what those remarks mean, but presidential historian Jane Hampton Cook looked into this and slightly disagrees. Is that right, Jane?
That's right. I think Vice President Biden is exaggerating a little bit. And we see that on both sides of the aisle, some exaggeration, but it's hard to make a case that what has been on Barack Obama's desk has been first instance. I mean, when you look at the Great Depression, we reached 25% unemployment at its peak. That's a quarter of the population. Today, we're looking at, 8.3% unemployment, a far different scale. And so that just doesn't make the vice president's case, I think.
I guess what I'm wondering is why he would say something that he knows is just laughably off the mark. And say what you will of FDR, the times that he inherited, whatever, but he genuinely did come into the middle of a bad mess, taking nothing away from this president and what he came into post a financial meltdown. They're very serious, what have you. But is there even a comparison?
Well, it's really difficult to compare. I mean, if you want to look at scale and proportion, it's very challenging, I think, to make that comparison. I mean, certainly we have been living in difficult times. I mean, unemployment has affected my family. It's difficult to get through a great recession even. But it just, scale-wise, I think it's just very hard to make that case.
Then why do you think he's making it, Jen? Why do you think the vice president, assuming he's still assured of being on the ticket, and maybe he's sucking up to his boss, who knows, but assuming that's still on, then why make such a comparison? To remind people of just what a mess the president had, because he keeps mentioning that even now, or what? What would be the upside?
I think that that's probably why, to just show how bad things have been by making this comparison and saying we have just really been dealing with things that have never been dealt with before. That's one way to bolster the case that, hey, my guy's up to the job, my guy has this backbone that can do it. And I think that's probably why you see Vice President Biden making some of these comments.
But is it's something more intrinsic going on here? In other words, say, look, we know things aren't great. We know this recovery isn't robust, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we had. And what they're trying to say is just remember what we had. This is better than what we had. Is that the idea?
I think that's perhaps, the idea. I think to try to say that, hey, FDR's had more straightforward consequences and we don't. When you look back at history, things in the middle, when you're in the middle of something, you can't see the future. And it's easier to look back at history and say, well, that was a little easier, that was more straightforward, and today it's just much more complex. When in fact, it's always complex. It was complex for FDR, it was complex for Ford, President Ford, when he was dealing with the fall of Saigon. It's always complex. And so I think Biden's just trying to bolster his guy and say, hey, he's the one that can win the next election.
All right, all right. Well, thanks for your expertise on this as always, Jane. Jane Hampton Cook. Well, Democrats are